Begin with another top aide from the Trump White House testifying before the January 6th committee. Former acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney sat for about 2.5 hours behind closed doors yesterday. He served in the White House from late 2018 until March of 2020. He then was appointed special envoy to Northern Ireland, but resigned in the aftermath of the Capitol attack. Here's what Mulvaney said to reporters before and after meeting with the committee.
What you plan to tell the committee today?
The truth? How about that for a start?
And were you asked to come in, or did you volunteer to come in?
I was asked to come in.
You asked to come in. Subpoena or no?
I honestly was just asked to come in.
Were you in contact with anybody in the White House from the time period December to January 2020?
January
of 2021, during the time period that they focus on, the committee has been focusing on?
I haven't talked to anybody in the White House in a long time.
Mulvaney has been outspoken about the January 6th investigation and about Donald Trump's role in the attack after some tried to cast doubt on the explosive testimony of former White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson. Mulvaney tweeted this, quote, "I know her. I don't think she's lying." And here is what Mulvaney said the day after the attack when he announced his resignation.
Two things I think caught me as I was watching yesterday. Number one, the president had always in the past had sort of, he'd thrown out hyperbolic ideas. He'd say something in a meeting about why wouldn't we do X? And everybody knew that was a bridge too far. You tell him, no, Mr. President, that's not how it works. And he goes, yeah, you're right. That he thinks out loud. That's what he does. It's one of his mannerisms. What I think you saw yesterday was the result of an entirely different group of advisors inside the White House, who instead of sort of saying, "Oh, Mr. President, let's talk about that," saying, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea, Mr. President." I mean, you've got folks like Peter Navarro, Lin Wood, and Rudy Giuliani in the inner circle. But the thing I think, Joe, that we need to talk about as a country is that there was a large number of people, a large group of people yesterday who were willing to do this. That if the President of the United States went on stage and said, go march down the street and invade the Capitol, and they did. That's what stunned me. When the President of the United States encourages people to interrupt a constitutional process and violently have an insurrection against the government of the United States, then nothing is off the table in terms of the discussion that comes after that.
That's President Trump's former acting chief of staff the day after January 6th. That was from January 7th, 2021. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo confirmed he also is in discussions to meet with the January 6th committee. CNN reports former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has met with the panel and that former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe is negotiating terms for a potential interview. As the Justice Department's criminal investigation zeroes in on Donald Trump, NBC News confirms the January 6th committee has formalized a path to share information with the DOJ. Politico was the first to report the committee intends to share 20 transcripts of witness testimony, but no word yet on which interviews will be provided. Federal prosecutors have been trying to access the committee's transcripts since April, but lawmakers have until now resisted. And new reporting from the New York Times that Attorney General Merrick Garland wants to make sure Trump supporters do not have any basis to claim the investigation into January 6 was driven by animosity toward the former president. People close to Garland telling the Times he never seriously focused on Trump from the start, unlike how investigators focused on him during their investigation into the Trump campaign's connections to Russia and Hillary Clinton during her email probe. Joining us now, one of the reporters behind that story, Justice Department reporter for the New York Times, Katie Benner. Also with us, the host of MSNBC's The Beat, Ari Melber. Ari is hosting a special report tonight called Inside Trump's Election Plot. Good morning to you both. Katie, I want to start with your reporting there about the focus and sort of tactics of the Department of Justice. Merrick Garland sitting with Lester Holt this week, being much more public and declaring what the DOJ is up to here in its investigation without offering specific details. What does that look like from his perspective? Is he answering some of the criticism that perhaps DOJ is moving too slowly here?
I think that Merrick Garland is always quietly answering those critics and saying that it's not a matter of speed, it's a matter of being meticulous, it's a matter of making no mistakes, and it's a matter of having a bulletproof case. And in our reporting, we found that every combination of Attorney General, Acting Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, going all the way back to January 6 itself, was really cognizant of how skillfully Trump and his supporters were able to attack the department especially in the Russia investigation, for minor errors, sloppy mistakes, and then more egregious errors or errors around the Carter Page FISA. And so it became really important, even on January 6th as the investigation began, to give Donald Trump no room to be able to do that. Keep in mind, former acting attorney general Jeff Rosen, his deputy Richard Donahue, they had just experienced firsthand how the president was willing to attack the department and undermine its findings. So this was really top of mind. And by the time Garland gets there, this worry is really baked into the investigation, and Garland believes rightfully so. Everything that they are doing now, as secretive as it is, as little as we know, will someday be made completely public, between oversight, investigation, possible special counsel, looking into everything all of these investigators, FBI agents, and prosecutors have done. Right now, this is a closed-door investigation to us, but it will be someday very, very public.
And Ari, the Attorney General said explicitly to Lester this week, yes, the January 6th committee hearings have been enlightening to us at the Department of Justice. It brought new information that we are, in fact, looking into. And you look at this list, Steve Mnuchin, Mike Pompeo, John Ratcliffe, potentially, Mick Mulvaney. The list of Trump officials who are not cooperating is getting shorter by the day.
Yeah, it's getting much shorter. And as you say, Willie, that's an important sign that both probes, the House probe, which was debated for a long time about whether this would be significant and serious or not, and then obviously a DOJ probe, which, mess with that at your own peril, both are being taken seriously. Mulvaney's saying he wants to tell the truth, which is a way of acknowledging the legitimacy of the House probe, that he thinks it is a place where the truth matters and he wants to engage in it. To the New York Times reporting, I would say really interesting reporting, but it raises profound questions about whether the Justice Department or Merrick Garland have learned the wrong lessons. If they think that how they do the probe substantively and the facts will somehow move the audio chamber and the main propaganda arms of MAGA, I don't know that they've learned any lessons. This is not a debate with William F. Buckley where certain facts will be acknowledged and then opinions will be exchanged. This is much closer nowadays, and I think viewers know this, to a debate with Alex Jones, where facts have no bearing in the words used and the ideas exchanged. And so, no, I don't think the Justice Department should overly target or overly obsess over Donald Trump as a person, and certainly his politics and history should have nothing to do with the probe. But what they should do is follow the evidence of crimes. We know they've searched Trump officials' offices, homes, patted down John Eastman to get his phone. We know that you do that because an independent judge said there's criminal evidence. If they are going full Comey or Comey 2.0, Willie, if they are trying to game out later reactions in the political sphere, they're already losing. And so any sign, again, we'll keep an open mind about why and what they're doing because we don't have full visibility. We're getting into that tonight at 6 p.m. with the visibility we have on the evidence, not the internal probe. But if they're going down the Comey lane of trying to pre-butt InfoWars attacks, they're already losing.
So, Katie, to that point, the reporting is that, Donald Trump was not the immediate focus of this probe, but we've heard that it certainly has ramped up. And we heard from the Attorney General this week say, look, no man is above the law. So this is obviously difficult to game out, Katie, because of how opaque this investigation is. But is there a sense of timeline and targets, how long this could continue beyond just the usual answer of as long as it takes? Realistically, how long can the DOJ keep this probe going before they make a decision?
Well, I would first say that they're not trying to pre-butt outcomes with Alex Jones. They're actually trying to pre-butt outcomes with their own Inspector General, who was critical of the investigation into Russia. Their own Inspector General, their own people, their own officials who found wrongdoing. This is not about reaching into the MAGA blogosphere and trying to pre-butt anything. They're trying to do it. They're trying to actually not be Jim Comey, who publicly spoke about investigations into Hillary Clinton. And I think that most people agree that that was the wrong thing to do. Jim Comey, who publicly spoke about investigations into Donald Trump because he wanted to have a special counsel convened. So this is what they're actually trying to avoid. And I think a lot of the regulations were not just about the Russia investigation, not regulations, excuse me, a lot of these changes were not just about the Russia investigation. A lot of the caution was about the Clinton investigation, too. Keep in mind, it was a couple of low-level FBI agents who opened that up with no higher-level approval. It's hard to imagine that Hillary Clinton would have been investigated if that had to be run up the chain and properly vetted with top FBI and DOJ officials. In terms of the investigation itself, I do think that as long as it takes is the answer. There are people who are very worried about what will happen if Trump runs. They're very worried about what happens when he becomes a candidate. It doesn't really change the investigation, except that Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco would have to sign off on direct investigative steps into Trump. It doesn't mean that they cannot investigate Trump himself. It doesn't mean that they cannot indict Trump himself. So I think that for them, the timeline is however long it takes to build the kind of airtight argument that can win in court. And that is something that is not done overnight.
Okay, and there is more news this morning surrounding the investigation. It's a little bit perplexing. According to the